planning process, let you know about how we got this project funded, where we are in development, and then give you some ideas about next steps and when you can ask questions. You are welcome to submit questions throughout this presentation. Submit them in the chat box. We will be stopping at the end to answer any questions that have come along. So let's begin. I just want to introduce you a little more in depth to the people who are talking today. As mentioned, my name is Katie Shackelford. I'm a certified planner and a professional transportation planner. I have about 9 years of experience. The first 5 of those, I was working in the public sector. I only recently came to the St. Louis area in the fall of 2018, where I joined Lockmuller Group as their senior planner. My background with this project really stems from more of a traffic side of analysis, where we were looking at the Cortex Innovation District and the Medical District on traffic impacts and congestion in that area, and how that kind of pulled together with the Tower Grove connector to create this solution. So along with me today are my partners in crime, Taylor Marsh and Paul Tenyas. So I'll let them introduce themselves.
Thank you, Katie. I'm Paul Tenyas, also a certified planner with SWT Design. Our main office is in St. Louis, but I actually lead our Louisville, Kentucky office now. So no longer a member of the Missouri chapter. I'm a member of Kentucky and Indiana chapters now. But I've been involved with the Cortex District and with this project in a variety of ways for a pretty long time. I actually worked on the Cortex Commons, the Cortex Streetscape projects starting in about 2012. And then through that relationship worked on the, as a follow-up to some of the things that Taylor is going to talk about, the alignment study, worked with Katie and Lockmuller on the routing of this from Tower Grove up to Cortex and beyond. And then I'm now working on the actual development of the design. So I've been involved in the area, since about 2012, and with this particular effort for probably almost 5 years now. So Taylor.
Thanks, Paul. I'm Taylor March. I'm the Director of Policy at TrailNet, which is a nonprofit organization with over a 30-year history of advocating for people walking, biking, and taking public transit in the St. Louis region. And my involvement with this project goes back as long as my involvement in the organization, so over 6 years in kind of community organizing around the need for increased safety, walkability, bikeability of this corridor. And so I'm really excited to talk about where the project is at today and talk a little bit about how we got here.
And with that, let's get started. Just want to provide you guys a little bit of context before we dive in. So for those who are uninitiated, the Tower Grove connector is going to be a 1.4-mile cycle track, a protected place for people on bikes, intended to link the Tower Grove neighborhood to Forest Park Southeast. Now, in the long term, there is a vision for this to connect all the way through to the Cortex Innovation District. And so assume that phases beyond this project will go in that direction. For those who are coming from outside of St. Louis, here's just something to orient you. The corridor is in particular one of the hottest growing and most congested areas of the city. There's a number of major employers and highly populated neighborhoods in this area. And that's one of the reasons that this initiative became so important. In addition, we just want to couch this to let you know that this phase that we're talking about really is the design engineering phase. The full project is going to go, we kicked off in December of 2020. Construction is intended to be complete by around spring or summer of 2024, given that there are no major complications. So the phases we're talking about today really end in the end of 2022, where things move from engineering and design into construction and implementation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Taylor. He's going to talk to you about some foundation materials.
Great, thanks, Katie. So to start, we're going to start off on what is a cycle track. So cycle tracks are kind of an emerging best practice and in terms of bicycle facility design in the United States, something that we hadn't really seen a whole lot of in the last decade, but are rapidly being deployed kind of across the United States. The thing that separates them from other bicycle facilities is the separation from other car traffic. And so, they really have some kind of element that protects them physically from people who are driving. they're also more comfortable for people of all ages and abilities. So the main reason that we're seeing them being deployed more is to get folks that we otherwise wouldn't see on bikes comfortable in street spaces. So think children, think folks with disabilities, folks on recumbents, not your typical kind of like, person who's comfortable riding in traffic. A lot of times we see these encouraging people to use the bike facility instead of the sidewalk. So a lot of the users that we are kind of aiming for are ones that wouldn't be riding if it was just an on-street, unprotected facility. They can be either one or two-way. And in this case, we're talking about a two-way cycle track. And they're best used on roads with more than 6,000 cars per day or car speeds greater than 26 miles per hour. And that's actual operating speeds and not posted speeds. That's the current guidance. So we'll get into that a little bit as well. But again, this is really centering on this interested but concerned group of people who are potential bike riders. So a lot of the facilities that we've seen deployed in St. Louis and other major cities have really focused on the somewhat confident or highly confident riders. And what cycle tracks and other low stress facilities do is really engage with folks that we wouldn't otherwise see on the roads. Children, again, folks with disabilities, people who are a lot more concerned about the safety that they feel as they ride. We'll go to the next slide. So here are some local cycle track examples or things that could be categorized as cycle tracks. So on the left, this is Skinker and Forest Park Parkway, Skinker and Forsyth by Washington University's campus. There's a two-way cycle track with a sidewalk separated by a little cobblestone buffer. In the center is Lenore K. Sullivan by the Arch Grounds, again, two-way. And then on the right is Chestnut by Keener Plaza downtown. And that's a one-way facility. So I want to highlight some of the emerging guidance for these. So a lot of this is coming out of NACTO, which is an organization that is kind of the leading group on bicycle facility design in the United States, taking a lot of the best practices from Europe and figuring out what the application in the United States looks like. Group of cities that were kind of unsatisfied with the way that things were rolling out, how quickly recommendations were coming down from the federal level. And so they decided to kind of make their own. So this is their low stress bicycle facility guidance that just came out a few years ago. And so in red, we can see kind of about where Tower Grove Avenue is. So Tower Grove Avenue has a posted speed of 25 miles an hour and an ADT or the number of cars per day of around 8,000. So from that, we can really see that this is falling into a protected facility in order to get us to a place where we're accommodating folks of all ages and abilities. If you want to go to the next slide. And then the next is FHWA, which is the Federal Highway Administration. This is their chart. It's a little less, clear cut. The NACTO chart has very, straightforward, clear boundaries. The FHWA guidance has intentionally a little bit fuzzy edges to it, but still within that 8,000 cars per day and operating speed of around 30. So we're kind of bumping up from the speed limit. We're for sure in that separated facility. And that's important to note because a lot of DOTs and state agencies look to FHWA as kind of the de facto guidance for a lot of the facilities as they're implementing those. So I want to switch gears a little bit to kind of how we got here in the first place. Why are we talking about Tower Grove Avenue? Why this connection specifically? So Tower Grove Avenue has a lot of historic use. So TrailNet has been conducting walk bike counts in the region since 2012. Tower Grove Avenue has always been one of the primary corridors for bicycle use within the city of St. Louis. This is a heat map showing kind of the major bike routes that people currently take. And you can kind of clearly see that Tower Grove connection coming up from Tower Grove Park. And then, you've got Shodo kind of going east and west and shown in kind of that high visibility line. And this is kind of also known from a lot of the community advocacy around this corridor. In 2014, there was a group called Safe TGA that did a lot of community organizing. It was a group of residents that were really concerned about the safety in terms of walkability and bikeability of this corridor prior to the Kings Highway Bridge closure. And they really advocated for getting the bike lanes and the buffered bike lanes installed on Tower Grove Avenue prior to the Kings Highway Bridge closure, so that there was a separate space for people. And that really set the stage for a lot of what we're talking about today. If you want to go to the next slide. Another thing that led into that was TrailNet's Connecting St. Louis process. So in 2016, we began a planning process to look at kind of a network of Bike St. Louis sidewalk upgrades that could really kind of galvanize and transition the city into a new place when it comes to active transportation. And in that process, had over 4,000 folks chime in with different kinds of input on the plan, did a lot of community engagement, had over 60 civic organizations at the table that were helping plan for what that network could look like. On the right is a photo of some community engagement that we did at public libraries. We also did intercept surveys at bus stops, on transit. Metro was doing their Metro Reimagined plan at the same time, and we were able to table with them on a lot of things. So really talk to a lot of folks about what this could look like. So next slide. And this is the network that emerged. So as we were planning, the blue lines are kind of the primary network recommendations. And then the orange ones are kind of some supporting recommendations. From the previous slide, you probably saw there's multiple corridor alignments that we explored. We're really focusing on street right-of-way and what could fit within the existing space that we had curb to curb while still achieving that low stress connectivity. On the right is how that integrated with a lot of other plans that were being planned at the time. So the Brick Line / Shoto Greenway, 20th Street cycle track, and a lot of others that the city is currently undertaking. Go to the next slide. And this is, of course, the Brick Line. So the Brick Line is a project that Great Rivers Greenway has been planning, originally called the Shoto Greenway, originally kind of looking at that Forest Park to the Arch Grounds and Washington University connection. And through their planning process, a lot of the community engagement heard similar things to what we did of, the need to go north-south as well as east-west. And in that, the Tower Grove project is shown as kind of a key connection that connects people into these kind of the spine and ribs of the larger overall network.
Yeah, and with that, like Taylor said, the Tower Grove piece, we were all brought together by Arch to Park, now Greater St. Louis, and Cortex to look more in depth at that and how we could kind of get that process really going forward so that it could anticipate or be ready to go to tie into the Brick Line piece coming through somewhere in the Cortex district, which was a little undefined at the time, but we knew that one of the goals was to get to the Cortex Metrolink station. In particular, one of the real challenges with that station, or not challenges, I guess an opportunity with that station is really the connectivity down to Tower Grove Park and to the Botanical Gardens as a pretty important kind of missing link in a multimodal connection there. So we looked more closely, and you saw in Taylor's on the Connecting St. Louis map, there were a few routes that were looked at and considered in this stretch, and when we looked at that a little bit more in depth, and through stakeholder conversations and through looking at some of the constraints on these different corridors, we evaluated Tower Grove going all the way south to Forest Park Avenue, a route that took us Tower Grove to Vandeventer to Sarah, and then a route that took us all the way down Vandeventer, basically all the way to Forest Park Avenue. And again, in looking at these, what we were trying to understand is where were the opportunities, where were the challenges, what was going to make the most sense. Frankly, Tower Grove Avenue south of Vandeventer is relatively simple. There's a lot of right-of-way, and you'll see that in some of the things we'll talk about later here. It's not a super challenging space to do this type of a cycle track facility. But when you start getting into Tower Grove north of Vandeventer, it becomes really challenging. The grid is there, the street parking is needed for the adjacent residences. The street is pretty narrow. The buildings are already in place. There's not a lot of opportunity for change in that space. So it's a really limited right of way. So that was a primary concern. And one of the other things that really happened even while we were working on the original work that we did at Cortex was originally, Tower Grove Avenue, the major movement was up Tower Grove Avenue and then continuing on Boyle through the now Cortex district before it was Cortex. Well, then the roundabout was put in place at I-64, and a lot of the things changed in that area in a relatively short period of time, and that changed a lot of the movements too. So trying to be responsive to that as well as we were looking at this. So this is a really confusing graphic, and we were even struggling with kind of the logic behind it a little bit earlier when we were practicing for the presentation today. So I won't take you through the weeds here, but ultimately what we decided was that Vandeventer, that Tower Grove to Vandeventer to Sarah, continuing up through the Cortex district made the most sense as the overall routing, particularly the stretch along Vandeventer because of the opportunities there for partnering with redevelopment as the southeast side of Vandeventer starts to redevelop. Some of those industrial properties start to change over, but there's opportunities there. It's also a relatively wide street and right of way. And then Sarah within the Cortex district, where there is an overlay, in the case of Cortex, an overlay district that's able to manage and help get right of way where there are right of way constraints, those sorts of things. And then it makes a good connection into the already existing stretch of the greenway there that will transition to be the Brick Lane Greenway. So.
All right, so now we've talked a little bit about planning. What I want to bring your attention to is project funding. One of the biggest challenges as planners is that our ideas or our concepts end up sitting on the shelf. And one of the ways that we can kind of combat that is learn to understand project funding in more detail and really key up our projects for their potential funding options. So I want to go over just a little bit of information with you about traditional and non-traditional funding for projects like the Tower Grove Connector, for an on-road cycle track, for bike lanes, or for recreational trails. In a traditional setting, with money that exists at a local government level, capital improvements and bond financing typically are the way that these sort of projects get funded. One of the challenges of traditional funding across the board is that it's competitive, and you're competing not only against other bicycle and pedestrian projects, but all sorts of projects that a city has on their docket. So you're talking about stormwater or wastewater, anything that could end up in a capital improvement project. You're balancing the needs of your community. And so even though they're out there, they're definitely available sources of funding. They can be harder to tap into just because of the competition. There's another resource that comes from the federal level. It's called Highway Safety Improvement Project Funding, HSIP, and this is all in alphabet soup. So I encourage you all to dive in. And if you have any questions about all these different acronyms, let me know. I'm happy to answer them. HSIP really is a safety improvement. It relies on information input by you as a submitter to let us know that the project is going to solve a safety problem where people are becoming seriously injured or fatalities are taking place. One of the things I want to mention is you don't want to encourage, you don't want in your system projects that are causing fatalities and injuries. So if something like that exists, this is an excellent source of funding, but we don't want you competing for something that requires you to have people injured or killed. Traditional, really straightforward surface transportation block grants, those come from your MPO agency, in our case, East West Gateway. Those are very competitive funds, and for a district our size, it's harder to get a bike or pedestrian project into one of those. It's usually coupled with a large roadway improvement design. At the federal level, you've got what was once known as Tiger, then called Build, and is now, as of a week ago, called Raise. That's a competitive program as well that involves a pretty extensive application process and a cost benefit analysis. So some of these are very straightforward. You're going to be competing. One thing I can say is I've put together some of these applications in the past, and sometimes, especially with federal bills, it really comes down to your political influence and the political influence of your elected officials. Once, while working in a different community, we knew that we got a project all the way to the Secretary of Transportation's desk, but so did 116 other people, and she got to choose her 25 favorite. So, you know, we were at a loss there that we weren't her top 25 favorite. And then finally, I'm going to say RTPs, that's the Recreational Trails Program. That's an often overlooked but very traditional funding source in the state of Missouri. That's offered by the Department of Natural Resources. Funding still comes from the Federal Highway Administration, but they are slightly smaller amounts of money, and those need to be completely off-road systems. So we really looked at non-traditional funding. Some of these things that we're going to talk about, congestion mitigation and air quality. The CMAQ funding is usually only available in communities that have air quality attainment issues, and St. Louis is one of them. Looking at private foundations, one of the benefits of private foundation funding is it's much fewer strings attached than if you've ever worked with a government grant. There's a lot of reporting, there's a lot of submissions. I've done private foundation grants that were 2 pages and received over $1 million. So I would say if you're looking for the path of least resistance, I would encourage that. You can also look at your TIF and economic development districts. Those are dedicated sources of funding, very targeted to a specific area. So as long as your project is within that area, it's a reasonable way to use it. EPA, there's a lot of surprising money through the Department of Environmental Protection, and you can explore some of those. And then finally, public-private partnerships have become kind of a big new thing. They're called P3s to the people in the know, and they are an innovative solution that really takes some of the burden off of local agencies and funding and getting these projects off the ground. In the end, the Tower Grove Connector used a combination of innovative funding solutions. We use CMAQ and a P3 combined. And I think really the big takeaway there is to let you know some details about a CMAQ. A CMAQ application is a very robust application, and there's a lot of things that go into it that are technical because you need to prove that you're having an impact on air quality. Our submission ended up being 145 pages and included letters of support, not only from financial commitments, but from elected officials and local leaders and people who are very committed to seeing the project come to fruition. Those things make a difference when submitting an application like this. We actually, in the end, we had to produce a traffic impact study for a project like this, and the findings probably will surprise you. A cycle track on its own is not going to get to win you a CMAQ. And I'll just kind of say that in a general position, but cycle track, after our study was complete, we found that the cycle track would reduce automobile trips by 1%. The air quality impact of something like that is pretty minimal. And so what actually got this project into the funding in a competitive way is what you see in those circles. The signalized crossings and new traffic interconnects. So the signal enhancements were going to improve the level of service at 4 of 10 of the intersections that were impacted. And the new fiber interconnects were going to reinforce or expand the system's connectivity throughout the region so that you could have smarter and more adaptive signal timings in the network. I will say, in addition to this, we saw that this traffic study showed we increased the average speed and reduced idling. So increase average speed by 2 miles per hour. That's not going to be a dramatic change. However, it is the timing of the signals together reduces idling and reduces the amount of pollution from cars just sitting in traffic. The official ask was for $6.5 million, for a total cost of the project of 9.3. We were really happy to be awarded 5.6 million, which is still probably one of the largest awards, if not the largest award that this program has had in the community. And that is a big kudos to the public comment period. If you participated, we thanked you. There were 97 projects submitted during this period. 90% of public comments that came through were for this project, and all but I would say a handful were positive. So it was really that put the project over the top and helped it really zip through this approval process. The other thing I want to talk about is public-private partnerships and how they play a role in this. So for those who are unfamiliar, public-private partnership is a collaboration between government agencies, private sector companies, and non-for-profits. So these are all of the different agencies playing a role in some way, shape, or form to the project of the Tower Road Connector. There's a number of benefits to public-private partnerships. In this case, really the biggest thing is that we were able to get a faster solution than if we had just waited for traditional funding to become available. It also afforded us the opportunity to stretch a little bit in some of the features that maybe the city on its own wouldn't have been able to afford or invest in. But it's really important if you're ever working with a public-private partnership, there's a couple big takeaways. Most importantly, in the end, one of these agencies becomes the official owner of the project. In this case, it's the city of St. Louis. So throughout the planning and design phases, we may have had some really big picture ideas and some innovative approaches, but it's most important to know, can the city of St. Louis operate and maintain this facility once it's handed off? And so that's something we keep in mind throughout all the phases of this project, that, are these the lighting features that the city has in their storehouse? Are these widths of things that the city can maintain? Are these plants that we're including that the city has the ability to provide maintenance on? And so that is kind of one of the things to keep in mind in a public-private partnership, is figure out who the owner is and make sure that you're working with the owner so that once it's implemented, everything can be maintained and supported for the long term. And then, our application ended up being submitted. We worked on it through the winter of 2019 and 2020. Submitted in February of 2020. They announced the selection in May of that year, and we got the go-ahead to start the project in November. So the kickoff started in November, and around February of this year in 2021, we sent out this message to all the members, either businesses or residents who are directly on the corridor. So if you live in that area, you may have gotten this postcard. Now is the time. We are moving forward. And with that, I'm going to take you into where we are in current development.
All right, thanks, Katie. Yeah, and like Katie said, we're really moving into kind of our preliminary engineering and design now. We know the route, we generally know what we're trying to do. We're understanding our funding and there are some constraints that come with that funding, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit too. But we call it challenges and trade-offs, and we should have probably said challenges and opportunities, because it's not all negative. This sounds really negative, but the thing that we're really working through now that we're getting into more of the detailed design is taking that grand vision. I think, Katie, I can't remember if you said it earlier or not, but the idea that, normally you go kind of big when you first go into a project. You want to present the icing on the top of the cake and maybe even put a cherry on top of it. But the reality is then you got to figure out how to make it work, and it probably ends up, a cake with like half icing and half not or something, somewhere in between, but it's still good, it still tastes good. And that's the important part. So, some of the things that we're working through now are things like trying to balance on-street parking, knowing that we are in some constrained right-of-ways in certain areas, making sure that we're still able to provide that on-street parking for residences, for businesses, those sorts of things. Working within the constraints of kind of the utility framework. Katie mentioned just the city of St. Louis street lighting. We're tying into their street lighting grid. We're going to use their stuff that they have a stockpile of, that they maintain, those types of things. Really understanding how that fits into this picture. The other thing too is, just in the age of the streets. I mean, there's a ton of stuff underground, and there's a ton of stuff underground that is in varying states of, varying conditions. So understanding how we work around that and work with it. Very, very extensive surveys were done. Topographical and physical surveys were done in the corridor to really understand what we were getting ourselves into. And a lot of times when you're doing the kind of the initial planning, you don't have that, you're not privy to all of that information, or at least that detail. And that's where things really change a lot when you kind of get into the design. The other thing that we've got to work with here, and it's shown on the image here, is the Shaw Historic District is an important segment of this along the edge of Mobot between Tower Grove, Shaw, and then, well, really I-44 and then Grand, is understanding what that does, and being sensitive to that. And then, like Katie mentioned, the CMAQ, one of the big things, and I'll talk to this a little bit more in detail as we look at some of the visuals, is that CMAQ, we're trying not to reduce the traffic flow. We're trying not to introduce congestion. We're trying not to increase idling. And those are normally things when you're thinking about bike ped planning, we're trying to do traffic calming. We're trying to do things to slow people down. That's not necessarily compatible with the way this project's funded. So we're walking this razor line here and trying to balance all of those things and work through it. So Katie, if you go to the next one. So we're going to kind of just walk you through the main segments of this and give you a little bit of an idea of where we are. And again, I'll just caveat all this with, this is evolving. This is something we're working through right now very actively in the design process. And so it's likely to change. These are preliminary, to say the least. But the first one we're looking at here, this is Tower Grove, right outside the Flora Gate. That's Mobot on the left for folks who aren't that familiar with this area. And that's Flora Avenue on the other side of Tower Grove Avenue. And this is the historically the main gate into the Missouri Botanical Gardens. You see Tower Grove Avenue already has bike lanes, parking lanes, and 2 drive lanes. So we've got ample right-of-way to work with here. And so this section I mentioned earlier is really not super challenging in terms of what we're trying to do. But one of the things when we were looking at the alignment, and you'll see in a second, is we really wanted to have the facility be on the west side of the street, because along the wall of Mobot, there's really only 3 little entrances into Mobot. So we've got like I don't know what it is, almost a half a mile stretch, maybe it's not that long, quarter-mile stretch with basically no curb cuts, which is almost unheard of in any kind of cycle track or bike facility design. So it's the much safer side of the street to be on. Whereas on the Shaw neighborhood side, particularly considering the legacy of some of the street closures and all that entails, there's a lot of weird alleys and different perforations of that side of the street that make it a lot less safe from a bike facility standpoint. So we knew that being on this side of the street was the place to be. But with that, and if you go to the next one, Katie. So you see the facility, the idea of the facility. We're not sure yet if we're going to be exactly at sidewalk elevation or maybe at street elevation. This rendering shows it at sidewalk elevation, but the purpose with that, and one of the things that we're really trying to be cognizant of, is making sure that there's a clear distinction between the bike facility and the pedestrian, sidewalk space, so that there's a clear difference in pavement material or a transition in elevation. One of the examples that Taylor showed is the Forsyth cycle track over by WashU. And one of the biggest comments that we've heard for years on that particular facility is, it looks the same whether you're on the cycle track or, there's the cobble band, but it looks the same whether you're on the cycle track or you're on the sidewalk. So there's a lot of mixing and willy-nilly kind of free-for-all in that space, particularly when classes are letting out. And one of the things you see around WashU's campus is that on later projects, like along Big Bend, there's a clear difference between the pavement materials and the way the cycle track is treated versus the sidewalk space. So that's something, we've learned from over the years. And we want to make sure that that's built into this project as well. And one other thing I'll just hit on this, so that you see the Flora Gate trying to really reestablish this historic connection between the Flora Gate and Flora Avenue as it was originally kind of laid out by Henry Shaw. But this stretch being in the historic district, there's a lot of challenges just in working in those confines and understanding. And we've been working very hand in hand with the State Historic Preservation Officer to make sure that whatever we're proposing fits within the context and within the way that the historic designation is spelled out for the neighborhood. So one of the things we've had a lot of conversations about, for example, is the curb. The existing curb on Tower Grove Avenue is a granite curb, like in many of the older neighborhoods in the city. So understanding because that is a contributing element to the historic district. So making sure we're putting that back. We're actually moving that out to the edge of the street to make sure that we sort of maintain that relationship, for example. The other thing And this is something we're working through is the wall along MoBot is very historic. And understanding that as we encroach on that wall, we have to make sure that we're sensitive to that. It actually has some structural issues because of the way the street was regraded back in the 30s, actually. So we're trying to be sensitive to that and work around that and maintain that historic character as we look at the space. So if you go to the next one, Katie. So then we get up to McCree, and this is really, Tower Grove at McCree is really the main business district that we're going through with this project. So our main concern in here is making sure that we provide ample access to those businesses, that we're maintaining as much of the on-street parking as we can, and that we're also bringing in elements that enhance the streetscape, so street trees, those sorts of things. So if you go to the next one, Katie. So you see us continuing up the west side of Tower Grove, and then actually at McCree is where we're going to jump sides of the street, and I'll show that in a second. But we wanted to get to the east side of the street as we approach the Tower Grove Van de Vender cluster mess that we'll talk about in a minute. But we knew that we wanted to have that set up that movement, and McCree is a really good place to do that because it's a very low volume stoplight. So a great place for a push button activated signal, for example, and we're working through the details of that. But it's also, there's, again, like just south on Tower Grove, there's a lot of room to work with here. And this has evolved even since this rendering in that we're actually to the point now where we're maintaining the parking on both sides of the street. This shows parking kind of going away on the cycle track side, but we've been able to balance out the street and work with what's there and maintain that. And that was really a goal, working through this space. But you also see street trees and other elements being added in, decorative lighting to enhance the space as well. So if you go to the next one, Katie. So here's that challenging intersection. Everybody knows it, everybody loves it. Van de Vender at Tower Grove Avenue. It is a raised intersection, so everybody comes up because it's actually going over two different sets of active rail. Two different rail companies, actually, two different sets of rail lines. So parts of the intersection are on a bridge. And then to make matters worse, it's a skew. It doesn't meet at a 90, it meets at like, 30, 60 or something ridiculous like that. And then it also has a fifth leg, which is central industrial. And nobody wants, and we try to avoid having 5-legged or more intersections whenever possible. So all of these things make it a really, really horrible space to ride a bike across, to be a pedestrian in. And there's also a good number of vehicular crashes in this space as well. So one of the key things I said at McCree was getting over to that east side of the street. And one of the reasons to do that is if you see on the right-hand side here, is that we're able to actually wrap that side of the street with the cycle track and continue along Van de Vender without having to cross any traffic lanes. And with that, we're actually pulling Central Industrial Drive out of the intersection. So we're moving that, I can't remember the exact distance, maybe 200 feet further up Van de Vender, and it will have its own signal that'll be activated when someone's waiting there, it hits the signal loop. And so with that, we're able to really simplify the crossing measures. And one of the things that's not very shown in this rendering, but that we've been working through is making sure that we're maintaining clear flow north on Tower Grove Avenue for bikes in particular, also pedestrians, but we want to make sure that Tower Grove, as you continue north, continues to be an important bike route through the city, because we know that there are a lot of those more experienced cyclists, the more confident cyclists that are just going to continue, particularly if they're heading over to, say, Forest Park or the hospital district, those sorts of things. And one of the things in Taylor's map, the heat map, just to point out, and having lived in South City a decent amount of time, somebody just asked what intersection are we looking at. This is Tower Grove at Van de Venter. Sorry about that if I didn't say that. So Van de Venter is the wide street going that way on the screen. And yeah, there, thank you, Katie. And one of the things about Tower Grove Avenue that's really interesting is South City, Tower Grove Avenue is a major funnel for the bulk of the population that live in South City. And it has to do with the city street grid, the railroads, the interstates, and frankly, the river that pushes a lot of the traffic through here for that north-south and then really this becomes one of those junctures where people start to go east towards downtown or west towards Forest Park, Clayton, et cetera. So it's a really important thoroughfare. So we want to make sure that we're maintaining that throughput on Tower Grove as well, though we're setting up this movement on Van Deventer. So if you go to the next one, Katie. So the last one to show is Van Deventer, and it seems huge. It seems like a giant wide street. It has parking on both sides today, 4 lanes. I would say the average speed is 60. Just ballpark. I don't know. It feels like it. It's terrible. It's a horrible space. But it is also transitioning. You know, like Rockwell, there's a lot of redevelopment happening on this east side of the street as shown in the image here. And then the north side of the street has a very different character. Northwest side of the street has a very different character. As you get into the Forest Park Southeast neighborhood, there's a very different kind of parcel size and everything else. But with Van Deventer, as that's turning over a little bit on that southeast side of the street, there's some opportunities to work with the right-of-way, work with some of these parcels as they redevelop. And if you go to the next one, Katie. So the big vision for Van Deventer is to try and create something that's still comfortable in a street that has to have a lot of throughput. And that's the thing with the CMAQ is, you know, we're still got to maintain the 4 lanes. We're trying to maintain parking in the space as much as possible, primarily on the northwest side of the street along the Forest Park Southeast side. But in creating a comfortable cycle track in this space, it's really about some kind of buffer, you know, whether it's trees or we get into some kind of a physical barrier if we end up really constrained with space. The idea is that it really feels separated from the, you know, I think it's actually marked 45 miles per hour on Van Deventer. Maybe it's 35 at this stretch. I can't remember. Do you guys remember? Katie, you're muted. Anyway,
yeah, we'll have to look it up, but yeah, we can.
Scott Ogilvie says 35, and you know, average speeds are well above that, as I mentioned. So the thing with this is really creating that comfortable space, but then also looking at ways that we can sort of tie into this new neighborhood identity that's evolving, where lighting and different materials and things start coming into the space as well. One of the challenges, and if you want to go to the kind of the lessons learned, Katie, one of the challenges in working with Van Deventer and with our CMAQ funding is we're really constrained from a funding standpoint to working on just the side of the street that we're doing the cycle track on. So we're trying not to, and kind of we're constrained by the project to not affect the curb line on the other side of the street. So when you think about something like Van Deventer that looks humongous, when you start laying out that parking lane and those drive lanes and the cycle track, all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, we don't have the space really to do what we need to do. And that's one of the things that we're being challenged to work through in this kind of preliminary engineering is again, like I said before, is finding that balance that is a result of kind of the funding, you know, to maintain that throughput, to limit vehicular idling, for example, but also introduce things that are going to improve safety and make it more comfortable for pedestrians and cyclists. So it's a balancing act, to say the least.
Yeah, just to add to that lessons learned, probably the most important thing is to, if we tie it back into funding, know that certain funding has certain restrictions. So in this case, the CMAQ, if it wasn't included in the application as a way to improve the air quality, the outcomes, it was not funded for this project. So anything beyond what was submitted in that application really becomes superfluous. You'd either have to find additional funding or, you know, something like a build grant / raise grant would probably have, you know, broader scope than a CMAQ. And so that's something also to keep in mind. My little anecdote that we talked about during the practice run, I'm going to reiterate it here so everybody gets the full story. But important lesson to learn here, if this is something you're new to, or you're embarking on this big vision, big picture planning, and now you're getting into the implementation. In my career, I started off in architecture, and one of my architecture professors said, in the beginning, when you create these visions and the ideas, go big, because everything in the universe is going to do everything it can to break it down into its most basic element. And that's just the unfortunately, we have to play nice with everybody, and there are a lot of factors that go into making a city work. And that's why we always start with this big vision, and not to be discouraged when that vision gets kind of chipped away until you're kind of left at the essentials. So keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind that we have a lesson learned, and we're keeping track of these throughout the process. P3s are very complicated. And one of the things that we have really reinforced throughout this process, especially with so many partners involved, is constant, clear communication. And when I mean constant, we are CCing about 8 people on the average email. So we're trying to make sure everybody stays in the loop and that all partners know when there are moving pieces happening. Even though we do that, there are still things that we miss. And so it's important to know that, this is a learning process. We're trying to make sure that we document everything for those who try to do this in the next phases, so that it's, as we learn and grow, that it becomes more efficient and more effective moving forward. Anything else you guys want to add?
I would just add too that, this project started from a group of concerned residents, right? Like a group of folks that were really concerned about walkability, bikeability along this corridor that had been really conducive primarily to just being able to drive on it. And so, I think this project goes to show, in the level of that we're at now, the influence that a group of residents can have when they really focus their attention and get organized around a specific kind of issue when it comes to safety for walkability and bikeability.
Great point. Thanks, guys. So let's go into, we're going to wrap up with a little bit of the next steps and where we are going from here. So I showed you the big picture timeline at the beginning of this presentation. This is more of the zoomed in work of the engagement that's going to be happening in the coming months. You see, we've broken them down into quarters because it's still spanning a very long time frame. Again, our role ends in 2022. So what you're looking at is the activities that are going to be taking place in the coming months. And we have quite a few things. We're wrapping up 30% design at the moment. And between 30% and what's called 60% design, we're going to have a lot of engagement activities, and we'll get into that in a minute. But they really all kick off with alderperson meetings and stakeholders, people who are directly impacted by the project. We're going to touch with them first, and then we'll get into the community and the broader audience beyond that. Couple things we want to hit on here. We have a project website, www.towergroveconnector.com. You're welcome to visit it at any time. We kicked off the process by launching the website and sending a mailer to those who are along the corridor so that they were directly aware this was coming, this change is happening. We'll be starting in May with the aldermen and stakeholder meetings. And those, again, are going to be the people who are directly impacted, major stakeholders, agencies, and those who need to coordinate with us for this effort. If you're interested, you can sign up for our quarterly email updates, and they're going to be coming through the website. Later on in June, we're starting with neighborhood meetings. We have 2 anticipated. We'll be recording those meetings because we do anticipate we're still going to be under pandemic restrictions. So we will have that meeting recorded and available for anybody who is interested in using it at additional meetings, but we will be live at 2 neighborhood meetings. And then one thing that might be really interesting for the people on this call, we are doing community champion training. And so through the network of bicycle advocates in the community, we'll be reaching out in the near future. Early in June, those people will be contacted. We are going to do an in-person review of the design documents and get the feedback of these other neighborhood experts beyond those that are contributing to the project on the consulting side. So we want more experts at the table providing their feedback and input. And then once we've reviewed and incorporated those comments, we're going to have a public open house anticipated either late July, early August. All that's in flux based on approval processes, because there are stages to this on the engineering side that we are coordinating with. Again, as I mentioned, this is our website, towergroveconnector.com. You can learn more about the project. You can find out updates, and then you can see some frequently asked questions. But most importantly, if you have a question, you can contact us directly and click on that contact button. It's going to take you to this page. If you have a specific question, you can fill out that little field, and there's a box below. You can ask your question. If you just want to learn more about the project and stay in the loop, then I recommend you submit your email for the project updates. And then Before we finish today, we just want to talk about measures of success. How do we know that the Tower Grove Connector project was a success? Well, really, we're going to bring it back to our project funding. Project funding, their biggest measure of success is going to be air quality improvement. So that's definitely going to be something we're taking a look at the end of this project once it's installed and up and running. We also are expecting and anticipating reduced crash rates along this corridor and fewer conflicts between riders and automobiles. We want, like Taylor mentioned, to increase the variety and kind of the type of cyclists and walkers, but also physically just see more cyclists and walkers using this space. And before we drop, I'm gonna let Taylor tell you a little bit more about how we'll be documenting that. Of course, as mentioned, this is really leading people to the Cortex Innovation District where there is a Metrolink station. So we anticipate that increased multimodal ridership will happen as a result of this, people riding their bicycle or walking to the station instead of using their automobile. And then really one of the major things we're hoping to see, particularly along Vandeventer, is a positive economic impact and a revitalization of that corridor, because this is going to be activity, this is going to be action on the street, and that aligned with all the other things and changes taking place, going to create a really great opportunity for businesses to thrive. So Taylor, if you can real quick, just let people know how we will be documenting those cyclists and walkers.
Yeah, so in conjunction with this project, one of the things that will be installed is a kind of totem counter that displays the number of people that are walking and biking along the corridor on a daily basis. You may have seen them in other cities along greenways and other things like that. But there'll be one of those that is going in somewhere TBD along the corridor to help visualize on an everyday basis the increases that we're seeing in people walking and biking. In addition, TrailNet, like I said, has that annual walk bike counts effort dating back to 2012, and we'll actually be upgrading that this year with a mobile counter that we can deploy at different locations to help categorize those increases as well.
Thank you. And then last but not least, just to think of additional considerations. This network, the two-way cycle track and the interconnected signals is not going to be working as a silver bullet to solve other community problems. And there's other things in this area that need to be considered for the health and success of the community and the city. So additional things as planners that I would like you to think about is with the increased activity and demand in this area, there's a lot of, we've seen displacement and gentrification, a lot of pressure for growth and development, which is positive. However, it comes with some unintended impacts, including, a decline in housing affordability and an increased potential for neighborhood displacement for those that have been in the neighborhood and working with us throughout this process. We also want to keep in mind that there are going to be direct impacts to the businesses and agencies during and throughout the construction process. So making sure that we build in ways to mitigate those factors is important. We're still considering access to parking and transit as high priorities, as there are many users of this space and they all need to be considered. And then last but not least, we're also keeping in mind, how do we encourage people to correctly use these types of infrastructure, and new mobility continues to come online. So how does a person on an e-scooter or an e-bike play into working with the cycle track, and where does someone who has maybe an electric wheelchair belong in the cycle track, on the sidewalk? There's a number of factors that we need to educate and inform the public so these things are used correctly. And so just as planners, keep in mind that there is no silver bullet to any of these. This one corridor is not going to change the world. However, it's going to make a big impact on the things that it is meant to do. And with that, I just want to thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to leave our contact information up briefly, and then I saw a number of questions come in. However, as I'm sharing my screen, I can't see the question box. So if anybody wants to read those off, we can get going.
Sure, Katie, I will be reading the questions for you. And as we're going, again, if you want to put any more questions in the chat box, please do. We have a good amount of time for questions. So let me scroll back. Our first question Did you end up listing MSD Project Clear for a local match contribution in the application?
I believe that we did not, because of there were some considerations to what was actually going to become of the buffer, if it would be planted or if it would be a solid buffer, and that is still in flux. So unfortunately, we did not reach out to Project Clear for an additional match because we didn't know what that space would eventually become, and we may have had a nominal or actually a negative impact on stormwater. So that's still in fluctuation.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is about the intersection of Arsenal and South Kings Highway, where it prohibits a left turn from Arsenal to northbound South Kings Highway. So therefore, people use the center drive of Tower Grove Park as an alternative cut through and increases traffic. Have there been discussions to open this intersection and reduce the traffic through the park and Tower Grove Avenue? Do you guys know the intersection we're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's definitely outside the scope of this project, although it's something that I know in working with folks at Tower Grove Park, it's something that's come up quite a bit. I don't know if Taylor or maybe Scott Ogilvy, if you can speak to any other thoughts on that space, but it's definitely outside the scope of this effort.
Yeah, I don't have any additional information on that one specifically.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. This is Scott from the Planning and Urban Design Agency for the City of St. Louis. And first of all, I'll just say thanks for the great presentation. We appreciate this is a big, complex project that we're all working collaboratively on, and we're really excited about it. So I'm glad you guys were able to present today. But specifically on Arsenal and Kings Highway, that left turn restriction is there because the eastbound lane of Arsenal is kind of narrow. And if you've got left turning traffic, you're potentially backing up Arsenal to the west. So there's kind of a constraint in the space there. However, as Paul mentioned, Tower Grove Park is looking at improvements to Center Cross, which is a continuation of Tower Grove Avenue. They're doing some planning work right now, and I think that subject does play into what they're thinking about for Center Cross. So it'll be assessed, I think, would be my answer.
All right, thank you very much. Did anyone have something to add in on that? Sorry, I thought I heard someone starting to talk. Okay, great. So next up, how would you describe the differences between public involvement at the project engineering level than it was at the planning level during Connected St. Louis?
That's a great question, and I'll let Taylor start with the Connected St. Louis part.
Yeah. So Connecting St. Louis was really focused on kind of like the grand vision, right? When we talked about kind of like the icing on the cake, kind of ideally, what would we like to see? I would say also Connecting St. Louis was a lot more of a framework plan for where those connections should be made. We tried to take consideration into what those connections could potentially be, but I think in the engineering side, what a cycle track or what a facility ends up looking like is governed by a lot of things that we don't always have control over. And hopefully Paul's presentation as to kind of the current thinking helps describe some of what those opportunities are, the things that constrain and limit us in terms of being really bold or changing things in a dramatic way. So I would say from a public participation standpoint, we can engage people on the grand vision of who should be able to use this space and in what way. And then we, in the engineering side, for at least for a while, we kind of have to refine down and figure out what are the limitations, what are the things that really govern the project that are outside of our control, regardless of kind of what the public would ideally like to see. And I'll open it up to Katie from there.
Yeah, I think it's important when anybody's doing community engagement, some things to keep in mind is what are you asking the community, and are you providing them a meaningful way to influence the project? So one of the difference between Connecting St. Louis and this project is we're really managing expectations. There are things that we can and cannot change. And so when it comes to engagement, we're really looking at how do we coordinate, what are the things we can change, and where do we give the public agency in that? And then explaining those things that can't change, why they can't change, and giving a real understanding. I think one of those important things we're thinking about, the curb, the granite curb, and the types of materials used in some parts of the project, even though we would love to have a full palette, we are limited based on historic restrictions or what's available in what material or plantings can be used. And so it's how do we get creative with what we have and implement that in a meaningful way? So I would say, primarily it's much more limited in an engineering phase than it is in the planning phase. In the planning phase, we're really asking the public everything, their input on all aspects of it. And here we're more refined down to here's what's coming, here are the things that are still in flux, and here's how you can have a say or respond to or be prepared for what's going to happen.
All right, next up, which neighborhoods are you meeting with? If not included, I would recommend meeting with the Tower Grove South neighborhood.
So I will say that we have a full list of neighborhoods that we would love to include, but we need those that are directly impacted by the corridor. We were only, based on budget, we're restricted to really 2 big neighborhood meetings. And so we'll try our best to combine those if, Shaw and Tower Grove South want to meet together. But at this time, I believe we're looking primarily at Shaw and Forest Park Southeast as those major neighborhood associations. But then again, we are not going to restrict that. Like we're planning to record knowing that we do have those limitations so that other neighborhood associations that want that same information will have access to it in some form, even if we can't be there live.
Okay, next up, are the baseline measurements for the success metrics publicly available?
It's a really good question. If you can review the application of the CMAQ, I think it's out there. What is predicted or what is anticipated based on the study that was done?
It would be something that, we could certainly look at including on the website. I mean, it's not something that we have up there now, but if, might be something interesting to add to some of our public materials. I think it's a great suggestion, actually.
Okay. Can you please share more info on what private foundations were part of the project?
Sure. The major players that we're working with very closely at the moment are Great Rivers Greenway and Greater St. Louis Inc. But we know that there are, in addition to those other funding, other private foundations and funding that have come forward. Not everybody wants to share, what money is being used. And I think that's up to those private partners and their perspective. So we're not going to enumerate who's donating what or what role each person is playing. I do think, there was something I had in mind when you wrote that question. There are in-kind donations in addition to financial donations. I think that's important to keep in mind too.
I would also just add that aldermen are also contributing funds and have contributed a large, just a large commitment to the project and really believe in it. So don't want to downplay the significance of aldermen in the funding conversation as well. So
yeah,
we kind of lump that in with the city, but like specifically it's through that aldermanic board capital. So I want to just kind of specifically call them out and thank them.
Yes, I agree. And that was actually one of the key elements to securing the project was the commitment from the aldermen that they would support this throughout the process. Would we be comfortable sharing the PowerPoint?
Oh yeah, I was just, there are a couple comments there. So I think Katie, you see this one from Kaylina. And then Scott shared that anyone in Tower Grove South is welcome to attend for those public meetings. And then finally, would we all be comfortable sharing the PowerPoint that you presented today? This webinar is being recorded. And then for the presenting team, are you guys good with sharing the PowerPoint?
I think we need to run that through our partners just to make sure
Okay.
everybody's comfortable with it. Because we will be doing this in many iterations moving forward, but we do want to check with our owners and the partners just to make sure they're comfortable with that. There was something Kaylina mentioned about additional funding and other partners that want to get involved. We've already been contacted by other agencies who see this already moving forward, and they're like, well, I would like to contribute as well. So for anybody who may have that in mind, we're set on this project, which is a wonderful thing to have, but we are definitely keeping track of people who want to contribute. And for future phases and future projects, we're keeping a list of those people that are interested and ready to contribute, and we're happy to take that.
Okay, great. That looks like the end of the questions that we have in the chat. No, wait. Okay, something more from Kalina. We've been told that the reason the Tower Grove bike lane is in such cruddy condition now is because aldermen are saving any restoration money for this project. Is that accurate?
It's not inaccurate.
I can maybe take a little bit. So there's a little bit more nuance. So part of the reason it's in such cruddy condition is just because of the utilities that had to go in and be repaired along the corridor in the last couple of years, and kind of the way that that's phased with this project. So there was a specific consideration in terms of, when the utilities are done with their project, it needs to be repaved. If it needs to be repaved, is there an opportunity to change the corridor? And that's one of the things that I think helped push this project forward, is the need to repave anyway. So if you're going to have to repave anyway, I think that's one of the things that pushed the alders and the city specifically to pursue a CMAQ application, is to say, why don't we go ahead and make these changes? Unfortunately, then with the federal restrictions, that draws the project out and does make the delay a little bit, but it comes at the benefit of increased safety for different users, and the fact that whenever it goes back, it's not going to have to be ripped up again in a couple of years. So.
Okay, so now I think that's the end of the questions. Anyone with something last minute, please feel free to shoot it in. Otherwise, we will wrap up for today. And I'll just remind everyone that our next luncheon will be on May 19th. We'll have some more information coming out about that in the coming weeks. And yeah, I hope everybody has a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.